This is Criteria.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras, here with my co-host James Mayevsky. Hello, James.
Hello, Thomas. Hello, everyone.
This podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. If you want to see what else we have going on at the website with all of our other podcasts, articles, and such, please consider going to CatholicCulture.org/newsletter and subscribe for any one of our newsletters. A lot of good info there. All right, here we go. The film we're discussing today really made me nostalgic for the days when we were going through the Vatican film list, because I had the same sort of feeling when I was watching it that I did during many of the Vatican film list films. You know, many of those are considered, you know, among the greatest films of all time. And looking back at the films that we've discussed since we finished the list, this is the first one that we're discussing that is on a lot of those lists of great films of all time. You know, it's for example, I read that in 2012, there was a group of 358 great directors, you know, your Coppolas, your Scorseses, your Tarantinos. I don't know why they're all Italian, but anyway, they got together and voted on their greatest films of all time. And they voted for Tokyo Story as the greatest film of all time. So what
you mean is that this is the first we've covered that's of that ilk, but not on the Vatican film list.
That's right. Yeah. Well, maybe we did during the Vatican film list, off the Vatican film list too. I don't know. But since we finished the Vatican film list, yeah, and it felt like that. It felt like, oh wow, this is like a really rich, like sort of like meal that I'm eating. It's challenging. It's very distinctive. It's very unique in the way it looks. You know, it felt like one of those one of those kind of like, this is one of the canonical filmmakers we're talking about. So I mentioned Tokyo Story is the name of the film we're discussing today. It came out in 1953. It was directed by Yasujiro Ozu, one of the great Japanese directors. And I really enjoyed this movie, but let's bring our guest on, our guest who suggested that we watch this movie in the first place, a returning guest who was previously with us to discuss Seventh Seal, yeah. And that is Irish critic and multimedia commentator Ruadhan Jones. Welcome back, Ruadhan, to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, James. No, it's a pleasure to be back on. It's a pleasure to be back on with this film, which, it's about 4 or 5 years since I last watched it. So to have an excuse to rewatch it was really quite a privilege. It's one of my favorite films. It really is. And as you say, it has, I'm surprised it's not on the Vatican film list, because I feel like it could have fit under there, either under the moral section or under the arts section. And I mean, look, if you were to take Paul Schrader, I don't know if you've read his Transcendental Style in Cinema, but I mean, he makes an argument for this as being a religious film as well. So, I mean, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but it's a film that really, I think it is transcendental in a sort of bigger word, like maybe not in a spiritual sense, but certainly it captures something of the transcendent, something of beauty in it. It's a curious film because it's distinctively Japanese. I mean, it's got that famous, Ozu has that famous style, they call it the tatami style, where he shoots from as though he were seated. You know, in Japanese culture, they're very often seated. And
like
yet,
on the floor.
You know, it's in the preeminent
like
Western. On the floor, yeah. So it's in the preeminent sort of Western, modern, dramatic form cinema, and as I think we were discussing this a little bit beforehand, and it's based on an American film, or it's based on Make Way for Tomorrow from 1930s by Leo McCarey, and it's sort of curious that, yeah, again, probably the quintessential Japanese film is based on an American film.
Yeah, I love Make Way for Tomorrow, and I've long wanted to discuss it on this podcast. And when I was watching this movie, I didn't know until afterwards that it was based on Make Way for Tomorrow, but I was constantly being reminded of that film. And then, of course, afterwards, I found out that they based it on the script. I think that Ozu hadn't seen the film, but his scriptwriter had and wanted to base it on the script. Of course, it's sort of like a Japanese version of it, and it's distinctive in its own way. And yeah, I mean, not only is it considered one of the great Japanese films of all time, but when it came out in 1953, it was not initially released in the U.S. because it was considered to be too Japanese for American audiences. And it was only, I think, in the 70s that people started checking it out and you know, catching up on Ozu in the States. I don't know about, you know, Europe and the rest, but yeah, so it's ascended into the canon. You know, Ozu Kurosawa was, you know, kind of recognized at the time that his films were coming out, you know, in the States, but now Ozu for several decades has been considered up there as one of the great Japanese directors, along with Kurosawa, and I don't know who else you would say, Mizoguchi, maybe a couple others as the all-time greats. So yeah, I'm glad that you suggested this film. This is only the second Ozu film I've seen. A Good Morning being the other one, so it's nice to get more into his work.
I just break down the story a little bit. So I mean, it's set in and around Tokyo mostly, but it's about a couple. Parents, Shukichi and Tomi, who go to visit their children in Tokyo from a sort of small town about a day's train ride away. I think now, actually, I was looking this up, it's about 3 hours away by train, so it shows that things have changed. But they go to their children and they're sort of expecting them to be high flyers in Tokyo, in the big city, and they're disappointed to find that they're small doctors and the other owns a salon. But probably the more disappointed that their children are quite distant from them and don't really seem to have any interest in them. And it's really a clash of cultures within Japanese society, but it's very much about the modernization post-war in Japan, the modernization of youth culture. And there's two grandchildren as well who are particularly, I suppose, obstreperous and recalcitrant. And it's a sort of, I don't know even if you could describe it as an attack on that modernization, because Ozu is so gentle and refined that I don't think he attacks anything in a direct way, but it's certainly a critique on that, in the same way that Make Way for Tomorrow is, that sort of the parents' generation used to, I suppose, respect and a certain social structure. They're just seeing that break down, but it takes a very Japanese slant on it. It's very much about acceptance and coming to terms with this. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Jean-Pierre Melville, Le Samurai with
Yes.
Alain Delon.
Yeah, I have.
Okay, so it's a very curious film because it's a French existentialist film which finds sort of correspondences in samurai culture and Japanese culture, and I think I can see where he was coming from. There is a sort of acceptance going on there that, you know, yeah, as one character sums it up, life is disappointing, but we kind of just have to get on with it. And I think that's probably one of the themes that comes out of it, is this sort of, acceptance, sort of quiescence. But Ozu is distinctively Japanese, the tatami style, the sort of minutiae of everyday middle-class Japanese life that he goes into. And I mean, I don't know what it was like for you guys, but when I first watched it, I found it deeply alienating and quite sort of, it almost seemed like a boring film because it seemed like nothing was happening. I mean, he doesn't go into detail on the big dramatic moments as you'd expect. It sort of skips over deaths and everything, like the big drama scenes, and then moves on to the aftermath very quickly. So it is quite disconcerting on the first watch. And I mean, I rewatched it with my family, and my brother, who is living in Japan, still, we'd watched it before and he hated it, and I was like, come on, watch it again. He's like, okay, I will. And he rewatched and he's like, no, I still hate this. He still found it really just quite deathly dull.
Yeah.
And I can see what he means. Like it does take a little bit of getting used to, but I think once you get used to it, it's a deeply moving story about dwelling on themes that are still pretty relevant today. I mean, certainly in Ireland and I'm sure in America.
Yeah. One way that this sort of was nostalgic for me of our time with the Vatican Film List was what you're describing, Ruan. This sort of initial difficulty or challenge of watching this. This is my first time watching this film. This is my first time with Ozu. But I did find that once I settled into the experience, which is it's a very slow one. I mean, there's something not just about the way that the narrative develops, but even with the way that it's shot. There's a lot of static images. The camera doesn't move a whole lot. they're from the very first moments, the opening scenes are of like, there's this like tugboat kind of plodding along down the river,
Yeah.
and that kind of is an appropriate image or metaphor for how the film seems to kind of just chug along at this very steady pace, and really take its time. So it's a long film. It's over 2 hours long. But for all of that, once you settle into it, yes, you find that the film is actually very grounded in its characters. The two actors who perform the elderly couple, sort of, who are at the foundation of this film, they're excellent, and their chemistry is just incredible. And at a certain point, I stopped believing that these were characters that I was seeing, and I just saw, my grandparents or something. They're totally believable as what they represent. But the other thing that I like about the film is that, in addition to what you both have been describing in terms of its thematic interest and youth culture and sort of how things are changing as time goes on, it's also it seems to be a really intense character study of these different personalities in these different generations, from the elderly generation all the way through to the toddlers and the children.
Yeah.
And there's something kind of fundamental about each of these, well, you could call them like archetypes of the adult children, the new generation as toddlers and adolescents, and the elderly, that is kind of it's timelessly relevant, what it has to say about how these different generations relate to one another.
Yeah, and this is very much a concern of Ozu throughout his filmography, and from what I understand, he's pretty consistent in making these kind of like subdued family dramas. The one I had previously watched, Good Morning, is a bit more upbeat, a little bit more comedic, but still very similar visual style. I think it was maybe 1959 or something like that when it came out, maybe early 60s. And he's got the two little boy brothers characters in it. He's got different generations. He's got the the people popping their head in from the neighborhood, and
right.
All of that kind of stuff. And he had quite a bit. He made I don't know, I think something like 50 or 60 movies in his career, because his career stretched from the 20s, the silent film era, into, I think he died in 63. And so he developed his style over a long period of time, over many, many movies, and he was able to be very prolific because of his, he pretty much was working, for the most part, was working with the same studio and a lot of the same, practically a stock company of actors, as well as the same screenwriter over decades.
I see. In addition to this elderly couple that's really anchoring the film, there's all these wonderful supporting characters as well. So the adult children in particular, and then the sister-in-law, Noriko. The film really wouldn't be as successful as it is if it wasn't supported by these great performances that, again, aren't like high drama. There's not like screaming and crying and these climactic moments,
right? But
there's a subtle way of relating that's super clear. Something that I was tracking throughout was these code switches that the actors would pivot into, depending on who they're interacting with, whether it's with my parents or with my brother or with my husband, and I think maybe in that sense, maybe there's something about Japanese culture there that's being looked at. I know that there are some other cultures that are more rigid in their social like the etiquette of interacting with different people. There's certain ritual, there's like a ritual politeness that you can maybe pick up in certain exchanges, like, oh, well, I hope you're not too busy to be doing this for me. Oh, not at all. I'm not busy at all. You know, it's almost like, it would be the same response whether you were busy or not. There's like a certain deference that's expected to the elderly. But I kind of lost my train of thought. I was talking about, well, yeah, just these code switches that are very subtle, but they're very clear. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just to pick up, I think ritual is probably the key term there, because if I would be interested to know why directors chose him as this is their favorite film, and singled out Ozu. But I imagine one of the things that it stands out about him is this sort of ritualistic pacing of his work, that you really do sink into it. He really is a master of pacing scenes, and of pacing, it's slow pacing, and of sort of blocking out the drama. Yeah, I mean, it is a unique style. Like you can kind of break it down in terms of he doesn't move the camera basically, and it's a mixture of close up, medium shot, and then occasional wide shots just to set a scene. But once you actually get into the film, it really is sort of just like sitting back and being drawn into a different pace of life, just a different world. And I don't know if you've heard of a book called Natural Symbols by Mary Douglas, but I mean, she is an anthropologist, and she talks about the differences between a sort of modern individualistic culture and, I suppose, an older, or in her time, a working class, more traditionalist culture that would have strict social etiquette. And I mean, one of her points about that was that a lot of the drama, a lot of the action is actually taking place non-verbally. So like in her way she defines it, in an individualistic culture, you need words for everything, because everything has to be explained. There's no sort of corresponding social sphere in which you're working that carries the drama, that you kind of just know that's Uncle so-and-so, I refer to him as such, this Grandma so-and-so, I interact with her as such. And what's actually distinctive then about in her case, the working class culture she's describing, is that they have these hard and fast sort of, if you're explaining why should I do X, it's because that's Uncle so-and-so, or because Uncle so-and-so told you. There's sort of the social roles, the social setting that you play into actually builds up this non-verbal, ritualistic style of living. So, I mean, I think Japan takes that probably to an extreme. But I mean, in Ireland, there would still, I mean, my wife is American, and she have found it as well, the sort of politeness that goes on in terms of different people and respecting different generations and stuff like that. It was quite alien to her. And so I suppose I would see a correspondence there with Japanese culture. But I mean, it really is about the breakdown of this sort of ritualistic social bed, and the sort of the incoming individualization, so that children are disappointments to their parents, not only because they fail to live up to the standards the parents expect of them, but also because they fail to respect their parents as parents, or as grandparents in the case of the grandchildren. So I think ritual, the sort of, like the Japanese are famous for having their tea rituals and things like that, but ritual really is what marks Ozu out for me. Just this ritualistic pacing, how each action conveys an awful lot more than any words could. I mean, I love how often scenes are sort of carried by characters just going and you just know what's happening the whole way through, because you've kind of built up, you've been ingrained into the social world.
I think it's probably important to point out, though, that this is not just a sociological commentary that only applies to Japan and the development of Japanese society. I mean, for the sake of, Ozu is often described as a very humanistic filmmaker. And I think my favorite thing about this movie is the way that it just holds up a mirror to parents and their children, particularly their adult children. And it may sympathize with the parents more to some extent, but certainly not in a totally one-sided way. I think he allows us to see plenty of flaws, particularly with the father more so than with the mother, I would say. And I think that on a spiritual level, this film has something to offer for people to reflect on the way that, one's flaws as a parent, come back to bite you, but also on the ugliness of a lack of filial piety, to be sure, from adult children towards their parents. I mean, and yes, there's a certain critique of like a sort of a pragmatic materialism in the way that the children are not really taking care of their parents on a human level.
Right. But that pragmatic materialism is reflected in the expectations that the parents have of their children, right?
Yes.
So I think that,
Yeah.
if on its best days, this kind of ritualized etiquette helps to, inculcate and preserve filial piety and a proper sort of like social ordering and respect. The dark side is the social mask that people put on and not really, relating to one another. And I think that you see that to a greater or lesser extent with each of the characters in this film. I mean, even Noriko, you can see how she wears a social mask throughout a lot of the interactions, where she might just be masking her grief, or her sorrow, but and I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but that how this social mask actually gets in the way of people really just being
yes.
Together, I think is something that you can also kind of track throughout this. And for my part, I recognized this kind of similarly because my wife's Persian, and Persian culture has this very there's a word for it, this like very sort of strict deference to your elders, and so I really recognize a lot of the interactions there in the film, from some of my experiences at family reunions.
But what's interesting too is that the elders are not really like, the elders are being as masked. The elders aren't like freely expressing, you're not treating us well. They're being just as polite and sort of like, more polite than their children, really, in many ways. So it's interesting. The elders aren't saying, I'm the elder and therefore I'm going to tell you you're wrong. It's like, it's almost like it's too late. I haven't seen my kids in too long, and we're just going to mask this and try to just cope.
Yeah, but it's also the danger about social masks is that you wear them long enough, they become your face. Right. So you actually sort of believe your own performance. So I think one of the tragic things that I see in this film is how the elderly generation sort of rationalizes things to itself, or doesn't see things clearly because it's so much become like a part of how they understand the world, sort of translating it through this rubric.
Yes.
But Ruan, I want to let you jump in. I know we've been going like back and forth on this for a bit.
No, and I was kind of reflecting. I think with Noriko is the real heart of the film for me. She's almost a Christian character in terms of her self-effacing dignity. Like even towards the end when she's talking to one of the youngest daughter, Kyoko, about, and Kyoko sort of getting mad about her siblings and how selfish they are. Like, Noriko, and just out of the goodness of her heart, is defending them, even though I think it's kind of indefensible the way that they treat the parents. But I think that sequence sort of sums up an attitude that's running through the movie, which I think again comes back to this thing of the sort of the correspondence between existentialism and Japanese sort of culture. I think one of the characters just sort of says, "Life is disappointing, isn't it?" And the other character says, "Yes, it is." And that sort of just sums up, I think, Ozu's vision of the world. Like, this is part of a trilogy, the Noriko trilogy, and pretty much all of them are about the way in which the things we would like to happen and the way in which we would like them to happen just don't come about. And you sort of have to have a sort of a reserve from that, like the father, Shukichi. Like, you just have to have a sort of, okay, yeah, our children can be disappointing. Our children are disappointments to us, but that's life. We're disappointment to them as well. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily an ideal attitude, but I think it is the attitude of the film. Just a sort of quiescent acceptance of things. And again, there is something noble. There's something sort of stoic about it. And I've always found that, I've always thought, and I hope this isn't taken as insulting, that the Japanese have a sort of noble pagan attitude about them. I don't know exactly what their beliefs are regarding eternal life or eternity or anything like that, but certainly in this film, there's an impression that death is the end, like that you're not coming back from it, and you're not going to, meet your parents in heaven or anything like this. So there is just sort of you just look into the face of things, and you have to try and get on. So I don't know if that is sort of like a social thing on their part, or if that's more of an Ozu thing. But I think I have seen it in some of the other sort of the honor culture that the samurai have, you know, falling on your sword and things like that. I do think it's bringing some cultural elements through.
I think what stops me from accepting that like quiescence, and you may be right that this is Ozu's point of view, but what stops me from accepting it as a viewer is that you can so clearly see that the parents are not sort of really dealing with their own failures. Again, I'm thinking more of the father, because I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't really see any faults due to the mother.
No, but I think that they're inferred, and we can maybe get to that after we talk about the father.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the father, we know that he had been a heavy drinker earlier in his life, although he sort of moved past that. But we get a taste of that when he goes out drinking with his buddies, who he's reuniting with in Tokyo, his old buddies. And there's something. There's also just something kind of horrible about, you know, that none of these things are said. It's almost like if you were to express your disappointment to your children, you might get to have a conversation where some development happened. But then what happens is that he goes drinking, and you get this in vino veritas thing where all of these old men are finally expressing the way they really feel, because they're drinking with their buddies, and this is not what they say to their their children. And they're talking about how disappointed they are with the younger generation and things like that. And one of the characters is accusing himself of not having raised his kids well, or spoiled his son and things like that. But for the most part, there's not a whole lot of self-awareness, as much as there is. In one sense, you could say it's admirable that they're not getting angry at their children exactly, and the main father in the film is trying to sort of accept who they are in some sense. There's also kind of like a deadness to that is disturbing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, and I think that this is the part of the film that I responded to the most, was how it seems to be able to, you can track how the sins of the father sort of are passed on to the next generation. It's not really made explicit, and I don't know that this is like one of Ozu's primary thematic concerns, but it just seems so clear to me that if this elderly mother and father, on visiting their adult children, are met with a kind of coldness and distance, that doesn't just come out of a vacuum. Yes, maybe there's a certain cultural degeneration that's happening, that this is sort of attendant to. But again, who was steward of that culture, right? And it's the generation before. So there is a causal connection between how you treat your children, you know, as you're raising them, and then how they're gonna sort of relate to you. Yeah.
Although granted, the war and that whole transformation of Japanese society
totally,
also hangs over the film.
But I think that this is, you know, it's most clear. This weakness in the parents is most clear in the father and the binge drinking. And it's said that he stopped when Kyoko was born, the youngest daughter. And we don't see her a lot. She stays behind, in the family home. But she doesn't have the same hangups that her elder siblings do, right? And so I think that there's like a clue there that she wasn't abused the same way that her elder siblings were, because her father had stopped drinking by the time she was born. Same with Noriko. Noriko is able to have a relationship with these elderly parents that's unencumbered by having been raised by them. You know, she married into the family, and so maybe she's able to sort of take a more sympathetic or compassionate stance because she doesn't bear the same wounds. But I think that, you know, those wounds are inferred by, you know, the way that the father speaks about his family, especially when he's drunk. But then also, I think, in what we see of the adult children and their relationship to their young children. Yeah. Right? So we get this scene early on. Koichi, is that the name of the adult son? We don't see him right away. It's his wife, actually. and how she's cleaning the house and getting ready for the grandparents and interacting with her children. And everything seems pretty good at first. Her like, 10-year-old son comes home from school and there's smiles exchanged. But pretty soon there's an argument between the two of them because she's had to move his desk and he does not like this. And so that's like the sort of first instance that we get of, oh, okay, things aren't all hunky-dory here. It culminates in this kind of confrontation between the two of them where she actually, the mother, begins really putting him down. She says, well, you never study anyway. And there's a turn there, where it's like we're not talking about the grandparents and the need to clean up and there's nothing that can be done about it, but it's now there's like an attack and a put down. And that's sort of
and we see the kid studying
yes
later in the film.
Right, exactly. He does study.
Yeah.
So it's not true.
I mean, he makes a point of showing us that.
Yeah, another moment of conflict comes when the father is taken away by work from a family outing that they had planned. And the young son is very excited about this outing. He's impatient to get going. And then they're not even able to leave because before they can leave, a patient comes and his dad has to go, see this patient. So what does he say? He calls them liars, and he says something like, there's never time or something. And so I think we get this hint that, that this is a child who's neglected by his father and, put down by his mother. And so, if we don't see in the elderly mother anything that's sort of obviously problematic in her character, I think that we can kind of read between the lines by what we're shown of the relationship that this new generation has with its mother,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are probably true points. I mean, I think Ozu is still making a slightly broader point, which is sort of abstracted from the individuals, even though I think one of the strengths of the film is how, despite his style of stripping back all the personalities, like apparently he would do takes, maybe 15, 20 takes, and just get actors to keep on paring back their emotional responses. He still manages to individualize his characters, but I think as much as anything, he's talking about a respect between parents and children and parents that has broken down, and it's not just attendant to individual faults. It's sort of the ways of the young are not the ways of the old, and the ways of the old are not the ways of the young. There is just a breakdown. I mean, I think we see that when they leave the family setting and go to the beach or whatever it is, the resort town, and they're sort of lying in bed at night and they're being kept up by young people carousing and drinking, and then there's a reflection by some of the cleaning staff about sort of an illicit liaison between a married man and a woman. So I think it is trying to make a broader point, if you want to talk about the sort of the sociological side of it, that is abstracted from the individual situation, which is why I think that Kyoko's reflection on the selfishness of the children is still both dramatic and highly charged and also licit. I still think it makes sense.
Yeah, another really interesting aspect of the film that is, from what I can tell, present in Ozu's filmography as a whole, certainly A Good Morning, it's even more focused on, is sort of the communicating without communicating, like the meaningless conversations that people have and the stock phrases that they use that don't really mean anything. I mean, the title of the film Good Morning is called Good Morning because it's emblematic of just things people say, adults say, that don't mean anything. And we're seeing it from a child's perspective of like, they just say stuff that doesn't mean anything, it's sort of done in a comical way in that film, in a kind of and still in a very gentle way. But, we start the film with this conversation about, what beautiful weather it is. They're talking with their neighbors. You're very lucky your children have turned out so well. When they get together with their kids, it's all small talk. They don't talk about anything that matters. And but that I want to single out that phrase, you're very lucky. That lucky thing keeps coming back. Oh, we're lucky. We're lucky our children have turned out well. As though that's a matter of luck.
Right.
You know, and what's interesting too is like where they come down to is they're recognizing their children are disappointing when the husband and wife finally sort of have a direct conversation with each other about that towards the end. I would say towards the end, but there's still probably like 45 minutes of movie that happens after this conversation when it feels like the movie's ending and it just keeps going. But they come down to let's just be happy that they're better than average. We're very lucky.
Yeah.
Like as long as your kids are better than other kids, that doesn't really matter if they're really good.
Right. Well, and then also this attributing everything to luck, like, because what's the inverse of that? It's that if they turned out poorly, it's a matter of bad luck.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not our fault, you know?
Right.
So I think that's present here. And that's the thing that for me as a young parent myself was most indicting in watching this, was just sort of this awareness that, oh man, you know, that the way I raise my children and the actions that I take toward them are so consequential. And it's not a matter of luck. Yes, some things are, but this relationship with my child, that's not, you know, that's something that's intentional.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if you consider it in another way, if you didn't use luck and said grace or something like that. I mean, because I think there is an element of sort of, I don't know if you know that there's a Philip Larkin poem. I'm not going to use the exact words because it involves a swear word, but they mess you up, your mom and dad. They don't mean to, but they do. And it's a humorous line. He means it humorously, but there is sort of a case of, you know, without grace, our sins do come through and our sins do affect our children. And I suppose in that regard, there is sort of a luck element. To what degree are we sort of infused with it, or to what degree are we open to it? So I mean, maybe in what seems to me quite a materialistic culture, it kind of makes more sense. And I mean, it makes more sense as well for the parents to read things in a sort of materialistic way as well. That, you know, being good children actually also involves material success. And yeah, I mean, you can critique them for seeing it that way, but it's sort of what else is on offer to them. And I mean, I don't know that. I don't know anything about it. I think Zen Buddhism is some of the background to Ozu's beliefs. I don't know if that's something that comes through from that, but certainly it's interesting that I think it is a transcendental film, but also I think that it is probably an incredibly materialist film. Like there's nothing beyond the material world in terms of spirituality, as it seemed to me. Like they do have a funeral sequence, but there is sort of you see the graves and you hear one of the children reflecting, oh, you know, I can feel her getting smaller, like she's leaving us. And I think one of the characters, it might be it's one of the daughter, I think she talks about how, oh, you know, this is the end, like there's nothing more. So I think in terms of that, I think I can understand it more. I can have more sympathy for it without necessarily agreeing with it.
There's like a Japanese proverb that's quoted a couple of times saying something like you cannot serve your parents beyond the grave or something.
Yeah.
So you can't serve your parents beyond the grave.
Yeah, that this opportunity to serve your parents leaves you once they've died.
No purgatory, you know, praying for the souls in purgatory.
Yeah, right. But again, you know, I think that I think that it's clear that the film's interest is primarily on toward critiquing this lax attitude of the young toward their elders. But I think that that's, for me, one of the areas where the film falls short is I want it to have recognized a little more clearly the responsibility that cuts both ways.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, honor thy mother and father is an imperative.
Yeah.
Regardless of what your mother and father have done to you. But, you know, it does seem to lay the blame a little too squarely at the feet of the children for being so, you know, out of whack. Even if at the same time it hints at the possible ways in which, you know, this complicated family history has brought the family to this point.
I might be more sympathetic to a sympathetic reading of the luck references. If it had been something like, you know, I don't know how they turned out so well considering, you know, what a mess we are, or something like that.
Right.
Like, oh wow, like lucky, and they don't have the vocabulary of grace to talk
Yeah.
about it, and so they say we're lucky because looking back, we weren't actually that great parents, so
Right.
they turned out pretty well considering. But there's none of that perspective, so it feels more like just like thoughtless,
Sure.
you know,
Sure.
remarks.
Yeah. And even in the moments like in the bar when we have one parent saying, "Oh yeah, you know, I spoiled my child. He was my only one, and so I spared the rod." Even that is a kind of unreflective self-accusation, because what does it really say? It means that my child was a screw up from a young age and I didn't discipline him enough. You know, like it's still kind of in a kind of in between the lines way, saying like I didn't do enough to control or shape or force my child to be what I wanted him to be. You know, so it's there's nothing like I didn't love my child enough. You know, I failed my child in love. You know, if that was acknowledged, I think that, but all of that it's present, right? So there is an integrity, I think, in these characterizations. And I think that it's something that Ozu is aware of, even if at the end of the day, he does seem to be leaning a little more heavily into this failure on the part of the children. You know, which is fair enough.
And again, you know, you don't have to be Japanese to appreciate the failures of the children.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty clearly, you know, they're a little bit cold towards them. You know, they're not making enough of an effort to show them around while they're visiting. They send them off pretty quickly to a resort just so they won't have to deal with them. And then it turns out the resort isn't even the sort of place that an old couple would enjoy going. And, you know, they're very stingy. You know, I forget the second daughter's name, but her husband brings home some cakes for the parents. And she says they don't need such expensive cakes. And then they're talking about how they don't need the cakes as they're eating the cakes that were meant for their parents. So it's like, it's pretty clear anybody, you know, it's not about like they didn't bow 3 times or something.
Right.
It's not some culturally specific thing. It's like pretty obvious to anybody.
And I think you've drawn out another thing which I think would be good to talk about aside from the sociological, which is actually there's a lot of humor at work in the film. There's a lot of irony at play. And I haven't seen these films, and I know that Ozu's background is in a style of Japanese sort of middle-class comedy, middle-class satire. I think it's called Shomin Geti or something like that. And he spent most of the 30s making these gentle little melodramas about middle-class life. And it's really as he went on that he sort of pared back and got to this very refined style that he has here. But like, there's still lots of humorous elements, and I was really impressed with how he works with the children in the film, because you know, child actors can be difficult to get good performance out of them. Can be difficult to sort of, you know, especially for such a controlled filmmaker, to fit them into the frame in a natural way. But I mean, there's some really charming scenes with the children. Sort of like you can kind of see one of them's hanging. The youngest is the grandchildren. The youngest is hanging at the edge of the screen, and the grandmother tries to come over to him, and he sort of turns his face away and runs out and stuff like that. Like it's really natural and really really subtly done. But I mean, even the sort of more serious reflections, like, you know, the drunken bar scene and stuff, like has quite a sort of air of comedy about it as well, like a sort of hangdog comedy, black comedy, but it's still there. And even right up to the end, like the final sort of moments where they're sort of, yeah, life is disappointing. Like I don't even know if it's intended to be funny, but there's sort of there's a laugh and a shrug somewhere nearby as well. So it's a curious film. And I mean, Ozu was a curious guy in that, you know, he's making this drama about children rejecting their parents or whatever, however his sympathies lie. I mean, he was, at first he was a school teacher for 10 years, but he basically was an alcoholic. He spent 10 years out in this rural school just drinking himself, and then came back to Tokyo to his parents, or to his family, but then wanted to go into cinema. And his dad didn't want him to go into cinema because back in the 20s, it was a really disreputable trade. But he sort of forced his way, and thankfully his uncle argued for him. So, I mean, it's kind of funny to think that, you know, this film, a critique of the children, of individualization, of modernization, of westernization, whatever way you want to look at it, comes from a guy who went against his parents' wishes to join a film crew and make a sort of preeminently Western and modern art form. So there's all sorts of strange things at work in it.
And he never had kids. I'm not sure if he even ever married. So,
He didn't.
but yeah, he's
Lived with his
very
mother.
concerned about families in his movies. Definitely not Kurosawa. No samurai. No
Yeah,
bloodshed.
right.
I think all but one of his films are set in are contemporary. I think his
Right.
first film is historical, and that's it.
I think the samurai sort of honor culture, I still think it pervades what Ozu was dealing with in the sort of honorable death. Like basically an honorable death is sort of the choice that you have ultimately, because you're facing into a long defeat. I mean, I think Tolkien kind of talks about it in the context of the noble pagans, like the Norse pagans, that they were noble in the face of defeat, and knowing that they came from chaos and were tending towards chaos. And I think Ozu, like on his grave, he had the character, the Japanese character for nothingness, inscribed onto his grave, Mu.
Wow.
Or Mu, I don't know how to pronounce it. But I think that was sort of like, it comes from a Zen Buddhist background, but I also think that was his sort of life perspective, that we were just tending towards oblivion and there's just nothing we can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But no, the other thing I wanted to touch on was just the character of Noriko and the focus on her being a widow and not remarrying. This is brought up in two separate instances, first between Noriko and the elderly mother, and then later, after the mother has died, between Noriko and the elderly father. And this sort of insistence from them that she should feel free to remarry, and that she ought to remarry, and that they're sad that she hasn't remarried. But we don't get that sense from Noriko that she wants to remarry, or that she thinks it's particularly sad that she hasn't remarried. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that, except that I just recently read a section in St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life where he addresses widows, and he talks about the value of being what he calls a real widow, or a widow indeed, which is not just a widow because you would like to get married again, but you haven't, but a widow who's really embraced this state of life, who is carrying forward the virtues of married life into this kind of single state, almost as like a kind of almost like a kind of religious profession. St. Francis de Sales even recommends widows taking a vow. So yeah, I don't know, what you guys might make of that, but it seems clear that Ozu makes something of it.
Well, one thing, this isn't about widowhood per se, but we do get comments that her husband was a drinker, just like his father.
Mm-hmm.
So we do get a sense of the continuing cycle in that respect.
Right.
So that's important. But in terms of Noriko herself, it's hard to tell. I think maybe it partly in some way plays into her connection to the parents, her ongoing connection to these parents years after her husband has died. And even though she hasn't been seeing them continually, she clearly has this piety and this love for them. And so that may be her connection to them may be some way of hanging on to her husband in some way. So it strikes me that that's just important for, as a mechanism to be able to bring this woman into the story, because she is an important outside perspective. And also, if her husband were still alive, the focus would naturally be more on the husband as one of the children.
Yes. But why this insistence continually that you should remarry? Why haven't you remarried?
I think it's to me it mostly serves to emphasize the connection that they have with her that they don't have with their own children.
Oh, I see.
Like the fact that the concern that they have, and the fact they're actually talking about things that matter and being vulnerable. Because we get two different conversations, her with the mother on her own, and then after the mother dies, her with the father-in-law on his own. Both of which they're being quite vulnerable. We get some of the only moments of tenderness. I mean, these people never touch each other, basically. They never hug each other, but we get the scene where she's giving her mother-in-law a massage after a long day. And there's the most emotion in the films basically comes in the interactions between her and her parents-in-law.
Good point.
Particularly the final scene with the father-in-law, which, you know, we were talking about, and we'll talk about whether this third act is superfluous in any way plot-wise, but one thing that it does have is it has a lot more intense emotion than the previous parts of the film, so it does sort of like bring forth the tragic element more strongly.
Sure.
So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose for me it was I had sort of read it as them seeing her as staying single out of respect for his memory, and that being both an honorable thing, but also something that they don't wish for her, that they actually quite like her and they want to see her being happy. I mean, it's also just, I suspect, a little bit of a married person thing, like, you know, you're happy in married life, so you kind of want other people to get in. I mean, there's that sort of joke about when you get married, you start talking to your single friends about when they're going to get married. So that might come into it too. But I mean, I was trying to track down a quote from Noriko from the film, but I can't quite find it. But I mean, she's such a sympathetic character, and I wonder, does the mother-in-law kind of discern in her what she talks about here? I'm just going to read out a quote. It's not the one I wanted, but you know, Noriko says here, "Sometimes I feel I can't go on like this forever. Often I wonder when I can't sleep, what will become of me if I stay this way? Day passes and night comes, yet nothing happens, and I feel a kind of loneliness. My heart seems to be waiting for something." And I mean, I do get that impression off her. Like she's kind of a character that you'd wish there was sort of a vocation to the single life for her.
Right.
I mean, you are living in it is a culture where, I mean, my brother still talks about this. You know, you get past 25, and women are sometimes referred to as what is it, Christmas cake. It's no good after the 25th of December. So it's, you know, it's still there's still some quite ingrained beliefs about marriage. So I mean, I think it's a sympathetic thing from the parents that they suggest that she gets married. And I also think from her, there's maybe a respect element for the son, but also a kind of, she is waiting for something. Like as she says, she's got this kind of loneliness. I mean, it's almost like a Saint Augustine thing. My heart seems to be waiting for something. Like her heart is restless and she's waiting for something.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I, before we do the third act, I would like to talk a little bit more about the style, because it's just so distinctive, and plays into my first reaction to the film. You know, because the film, it takes a while to sort of get a sense of what it's about, because it starts out with it's slow and there's a lot of small talk, and it takes a while to sort of realize, well, that's kind of the point. There's just a lot of small talk and there's not meaningful connections happening. But, so you have a lot of time to notice the visuals, you know, at the beginning of the movie in particular. And it really is a very, very unique style. We've talked about it a little bit already, that mainly the point of view, the camera being 1, 2, 3 feet above the floor, and then also the camera not moving. There's an interesting sense and lack of sense of spatial continuity in his style, which is very consistent in, you know, the last decade or more of his career. And you know, the camera movement, to me, one thing that it does is it connects spaces, obviously. And if you don't have camera movement, all you can do is juxtapose images. So the connections can be there, but they're sort of implicit, and the human, you know, psychology has to kind of make those connections. But even in that respect, he kind of does things that are unconventional. There's like a traditional grammar of film that allows us to to understand the spaces we're in and where the characters and objects are in relation to each other. And one of these aspects is called the rules about eye line, or the 180 degree rule, which basically, one example of that is like, if you've got two characters facing each other and they're having a conversation, you want to shoot from the same side of each of them, so that if one character is facing sort of left, then the other one's facing right, and things like that. He'll often shoot just dead on, or he'll like switch to the other side of a character during a conversation. And he does the same thing in connecting spaces, in that somebody will walk off the right side of the screen. And so normally what you would do to preserve that continuity of space in a film is when you cut to the room that they walk into, they will come in from the left side. But in this case, he'll have them walk off from the right side and then come into the next shot from the right side. So there's a lot of things that he does that in a way kind of frustrate spatial continuity. And there's also things that establish it, but in kind of an unusual way. And this is, one psychological effect of this, and I don't know if this is intentional, but in the context of this movie, one effect that this has on me is that the sense of isolation of the characters from each other is in a way amplified because the spaces and the visual like orientation is isolated. It's like one shot, one shot, one shot. It's these static frames. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then also, there's other interesting ways that like this amplifies his style, kind of amplifies the Japanese-ness of his movie. We're talking about this as like a very, very Japanese movie, because so much of it's in these traditional Japanese houses, and they have this particular layout. And insofar as he establishes spatial continuity, it's because he'll shoot successive rooms almost as though it's like a hallway. And so you've got one room and these doors are all in the same spot in each room. And so when all the doors are open, it's like a hallway and you can see all the rooms going back. So you can, if you pay close attention, you can kind of figure out where the rooms are in relation to one another when we change positions. But on the other hand, the one effect of the camera angle being so low is that it flattens the perspective. So you lose some of that perspective of these being separate rooms. It's like frames within frames, but you don't have the sense of how far things are because, the lower the lines aren't sort of slanted as much because the camera's lower. So he has a very, very unique style. And it does affect the psychology of the film. And I don't know how much to specify it to one movie versus another in terms of what it tells us about the characters, but it's certainly his perspective on the world and the way that he shoots these Japanese homes. Just like, I think if it were outdoors, there's certain things distinctive about the Japanese landscape or temples or things you could do, but the indoorsness of it and the distinctiveness of these houses makes it all the more Japanese to me.
Right.
Yeah,
and you also mentioned the pillow shots.
Yeah,
go
sorry.
ahead.
Yeah, no, you keep going.
You also mentioned these shots of smokestacks or the boat going down the river, and these are often things that I would say pretty much always do nothing to advance the plot at all. They're just sort of mood settings. That's where the music happenings. That's another thing. He doesn't usually almost never uses music to punctuate the emotions of a scene. It's more in these sort of interlude sequences. So he'll just give us this, and this is again in all of his movies, he gives us a succession of shots of clotheslines or smoke stacks or roofs of buildings or the river or train tracks or whatever, just sort of setting the environment. And these have been called pillow shots because there's some analogy being made to these pillow words that link and transition in Japanese poetry. I couldn't explain that to you, but so that's another aspect of his style worth mentioning it, but it's another aspect of his style that's very subdued and very kind of like non-emotive.
Yeah. Right. Totally.
Yeah, and I mean the pillow shots thing is, again, like Paul Schrader talks about this in his book, and he links it with a particular style of Japanese art and also, again, Zen Buddhism, which is that the silences define sounds or emptiness defines shapes. So like he talks about, and I've never seen this painter's work, but a painter who paints only in a corner of the page, and how it's actually the emptiness that defines the image. So I mean, I don't know if that's what's at work. That's what Schrader thinks is at work. There's definitely thematic things that you could draw out of it, as in, closing shots of a train rushing down a track, a sort of sense of emotion forward, but you never actually see destinations or anything like that. So it is, again, that sort of caught in a timeless state, like of nothingness. It's sort of your motion is going on and on and on, but it's not going anywhere. There's no end point. Or the chugging along of the boat. Again, it's sort of chugging along at this gentle, meditative pace, but it's not going anywhere. We don't see where it started from or where it finishes. It is sort of this loop feeling about it. and I think the pillow shots, to use that phrase, adds to that effect, while also giving us a certain sense of mood and things like that. And yeah, I definitely, rewatching it this time, it really did strike me that the spatial discontinuity, that it was sort of, it was very disconcerting actually. And again, it's something you have to adapt your mind to to actually get used to. I mean, I don't I think there are comparisons here that are valid. Like Schrader compares him to Bresson, and the way that Bresson breaks down arenas or physical spaces. Like I can remember one of his films in particular where it's like, it's a take on the sort of woman examines herself in the mirror shot, which you see in quite a few films. And he like just zooms in, and all you can see is her fingers and her hands and a small section of her arm. It has a sort of mechanical effect or a mechanizing effect or something like that. It really sort of flattens any emotional effect that could possibly be had on you. And I mean, this ties into his direction for the actors as well, in terms of asking them to sort of flatten their emotions. And again, this is very Bressonian as well, to draw out actually things that are sort of not dramatic, but have dramatic significance.
Yeah. Like I mentioned, the beginning of this film starts with this boat going down the river, and then it cuts to, I think it's children crossing the frame from left to right in each instance, and then it's a train going again from left to right through the frame, and then the last image that we get is also of this boat going down the river. So the film is bookended by this movement, and this exit stage right, the exit that we get at the end of the film is the death of the elderly mother. So we've referred to this kind of what I called the third act as we were watching it. I don't know if the first act takes place, when they first arrive in Tokyo, and then maybe the second act takes place, once they've gone away to the spa and then returned, and now they're kind of homeless, and we get the mother's stay with Noriko, and then the father's drunken binge. And then this third act happens after they've returned home, but the mother has now taken ill, and it's the children who come to visit them, to be at her bedside in her final moments. Yeah. That is where I think the film you begin to feel the film's length, because there is a kind of natural arc that has been accomplished in the trip to Tokyo and then back home, and you think, okay, we've had our visit and we've learned some interesting things, and now the film is going to sort of bring us in for a landing. And yet, that's not what happens. We get this pretty long scene of coordinating over the phone and telegrams, and figuring out that, our mother is sick and we need to get back to visit her. It's now there's this new information, and now there's a new chapter. And so on my first viewing, I felt a little bit like, do we need this? Is there anything that is being drawn out thematically that wasn't already expressed? We do get more. We do get things maybe expressed a little more explicitly. We get these conversations between, for instance, Noriko and Kyoko at the end of the film, where they quite explicitly lay out, these children are selfish and this is the way things go, and it's kind of disappointing. And but I don't need to be told that if I've already been shown it. So I guess that is the question, what's really happening in this third act that is new or important?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I hadn't really considered it, but thinking about it now, what I think the death scene thematically, what I think it drives home is something that Azu believes, that we as Christians certainly wouldn't believe, which is that people don't change. Like the death of the mother, you would think, and even actually just thinking about Make Way for Tomorrow, there is a sort of realization among the characters. They're saying, this is a terrible thing that's happening, blah, blah, blah. And one of them says well, aren't we terrible people then? like the sort of a dawning realization, whereas there's nothing of that in this sequence. What really happens actually is it reifies, it makes concrete again the lack of respect and the selfishness of the main characters. That even, after their parents die, and the son, the younger son who's working at the train station says, "Oh, I wish I'd been a better son to my mother while she was alive." You would sort of think, and I think in a traditional drama, what would happen then is that they would all gather around their father and treat him nicely, and they'd all probably bring him into their homes, and he'd live happily with each of them. But that's not what happens. It's Noriko again has to come to the rescue, and even though she's defending them, she's saying, they're busy, they have their own affairs. It's sort of Kyoko talking about, well, even strangers would have treated them better. Like I think it does add something thematically, which is that people don't change, and I think that's very much Azu's perspective.
Yeah, and if without this death, the audience might be left with some hope that these children will come around eventually, and that there's hope for this family to come together in a more meaningful way later on. But that doesn't really happen, it's now there is no hope. But I guess the hope is in, it's this kind of Zen hope, that is, the very last shot, well, the penultimate shot before we get this final shot of the river and the boat is, this widower now, sort of sinking into his stoic kind of acceptance of everything. I think we even get a line where he says, I'll get used to it.
He says, I'll be very lonely. He's talking to his neighbor, but he'll get used to it.
Yeah, right. This, I guess, maybe pagan nobility.
But I am sympathetic, James, to your point that maybe the movie would have been more devastating in a way if it had just ended with them. So they have the conversation between husband and wife about how their children have turned out. If that had taken place at home and then it had just said, "Oh, we're very lucky still," and then it just ended.
Yeah. Well, that was when I was watching it the first time, and I didn't have any sense of time, of how much time had passed or how much time was left in this movie. I thought that the film was going to end with them kind of having this conversation where they're reflecting on their time and they're saying, well, our children are better than average, and you know what? Actually, we're very lucky. We're very lucky, aren't we? And then I thought it was just going to end, and I was just going to feel like, oh, brutal. But no, there's still like 45 minutes left after that point. But yeah, for all that, go ahead. Sorry,
just to pick up on the word hope there. I mean, I don't know if this is an apocryphal story, but supposedly a Japanese classical musician who was introducing Bach to Japan played one of his various had one of these various performances, and some of the Japanese came up afterwards and asked him, what is hope? Because they didn't have a corresponding word in their language. I mean, if you think about that, hope is sort of a distinctive, it's not a feeling, distinctive belief or distinctive virtue, or however you'd put it, that sort of things will turn out well despite the seemingly chaotic or seemingly nihilistic world around us. Whereas I think this is a pretty hopeless film. I mean, I think that's one of the quite sort of depressing or tragic aspects of it, that there really isn't any hope for positive change in anybody. I mean, like Kyoko and Noriko's sort of engagement sums this up again, that Noriko is saying that the children have become estranged from their parents because as you get older you drift apart from your parents, and you have your own life apart from your parents, and you don't mean any harm by this. This is just what happens. And Kyoko's like, I won't ever be like that. Then what's the point of family? And all this kind of stuff. And Noriko's sort of like, well, I'm going to become like that. You're going to become like that. We can't escape it. I mean, it's sort of, it really is a very nihilistic worldview. And I think that's what's really brought home in that third act. Just how depressing things are, really.
Yeah, that funeral sequence is awesome with the chanting. Yeah.
Ruadhan, what do you think is the point of the interchange with Noriko and the father-in-law, where he's complimenting her and she keeps saying, no, I'm selfish, I'm a bad person, I'm not such a great person. What are we supposed to sort of take away from that? Why is she saying that?
I suppose what I took away from that is it shows ultimately what a good person she is. That she sees all the faults in her, like and maybe they are small elements of selfishness, but I think it's almost a saintly attitude in her that
Yeah.
she can't she can't look away from these either. She can't sort of accuse others of selfishness, but she can see it in herself. I think ultimately that's what it draws out for me, both that the father recognizes her goodness, and also one of the characteristics of her goodness is that she sort of doesn't recognize it herself.
Yeah. Her humility.
Her humility, yeah. I think that's what I took from that.
All right. So, guys, what do we think? Greatest film of all time?
I don't think it's the greatest film of all time. I think it deserves a high place in the canon because it is totally like singular, and this filmmaker is totally unique, clearly very influential, and the film has a lot of interesting facets. It's a unique way of doing a drama,
Yeah.
that I haven't seen elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so I think that it deserves a very high place in the canon, whether that be, top 25, top 10, I don't know.
25. Whoa.
Is
really
that,
kicking it down the list?
Are you saying
here.
I'm not? Yeah. I don't know if I would put in top 5, but
yeah,
if not for the the last act, I might put it put it in the top 5.
Yeah, well, I definitely would recommend this film for actors. Actually, so, a genre that kept coming to mind as I watched it from a performance perspective was film noir. I think that there's actually a kind of noir quality to the performances and the way these actors communicate. That is this kind of pared back quality, this stillness, and so I would recommend this for the same reason that I recommend film noir as a genre for actors to study, because there's a real power in that stillness and a real efficacy in communicating subtext and relationship in that kind of pared down quality. And it's just so different than film noir, the situations. So it would be a nice
Interesting
way to round out, that kind of a study. But Ruan, what about you? What do you think?
I think for me it's top 5. And I think for a
Whoa,
couple of
top
reasons. I think
5!
definitely. Yeah, no, it definitely it's a big one for me. I think uniqueness. I mean, if we're going to talk about artists, uniqueness is a quality that is sort of it puts you high up on any list. And his style is really distinctive, and his method of treating stories, this sort of elliptical way, just skipping over what you would think are the dramatic moments to bring out something different, is unique. His treatment of acting, as you say, is really unique. And I mean, I think it's a style that doesn't always work. I think there's sometimes his films genuinely are boring. But here, what helps is that he has characters that are really pathetic, as in pathos. They're really quite distinctive, and their storylines just draw out so many different elements. I mean, we've had debates about who is it siding with, who's it siding against. Well, it just draws out so much that in the end, it just sort of transcends that. But it also has a beautiful character, one that I think is really sympathetic and sort of almost Christian in her nobility in Noriko, who I've always really sympathized with. And I mean, again, I think you've got to remember in terms of its sort of nihilistic outlook, and the pathos that creates, that it was a society that had lost. I mean, it had lost the war. It was also clearly in Ozu's eyes losing the cultural battle as well. It was becoming less traditional, less Japanese. And I suppose as coming from another island that has been, as it were, on the wrong side of history, has lost pretty much everything, even our sort of, in the end, successful gambit for statehood was the failed Easter Rising, where most people just died in bloody deaths. I suppose I can sort of recognize that hangdog sense of humor, that noble gaze at a kind of a world that really is unforgiving. I think there's something very sympathetic about that. So yeah, for me, it's essential watching. It takes a lot of work, and you mightn't like it. As I said, my brother hates it. I love it. So it's not for everyone, but I think it is canonically something that you should tackle.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. I am ready to watch some more Ozu films myself. There's maybe at least 3 more that I'd like to see. A friend of mine told me that Floating Weeds is very powerful. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to see the people put this Tokyo Story in an informal so-called Noriko trilogy because it's basically that same actress playing essentially that same character in like 3 different family situations, and I think the other ones are late spring and maybe early summer.
Yeah, I want to see late spring.
Yeah. And so I'd like to see a number of those, and that Setsuko Haro, the actress, very beloved in Japan, and was in Japan has the nickname the Eternal Virgin because she apparently never got married and she was just this sort of like pure womanly ideal or something.
What a nickname, man.
Yeah, that's a heavy nickname to carry.
Yeah.
It's not like the Velvet Fog or
there's lots of Yeah. I mean, she had quite an interesting life as well, because once Azu died, she basically just gave up on films and said, I've made enough. I can now support my family and live a quiet life. So I mean, her and Azu were sort of strangely matched. He lived quite a life of solitude as well with his mother until she died. So they really are curiously thematically linked in their lives.
Well, thank you so much, Ruadhan, for getting back on the show with us. It's been too long, and so we shouldn't wait so long before we have you on here again.
Is there anywhere people can check your stuff out?
Yeah, if you go to irishcatholic.com, I've done actually a few reviews of the Vatican 45 list. So you can check out my work there, or else just on Letterboxd. You can just look up Ruadhan Jones, you'll find me there. But no, it's been a pleasure being back on, guys. It's been and I particularly as I can't remember if I said this on air, but this is only the second film I've watched in the last 4 months. I have a young child, so it was a nice excuse to really dip into a favorite.
Awesome. Yeah, well, congrats again on the birth of your child, and thank you again for being on here. And for our listeners, I definitely recommend checking out our discussion of the Seventh Seal if you haven't yet listened to it. That was easily one of my favorite episodes that we recorded during our Vatican Film List discussion. So yeah, I guess if you've made it this far, then you really owe it to yourself to like and subscribe, all that good stuff. And also head over to CatholicCulture.org. You can check out everything that we do there.
Why do they owe themselves to like?
Well, because they clearly enjoyed it.
But they owe it to us?
No. They enjoyed it, and so they want more. So just make sure.
Yeah, but liking doesn't give them more.
Well, it gives us more. So.
Anyway.
Go check out CatholicCulture.org. We got news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and several other podcasts. And if you want to support this work, go to CatholicCulture.org/donate. We would be so appreciative. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Until next time.
All right. Bye.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.